So most of this work is actually done by my former student, who's currently at Intel at Portland, Oregon. He just graduated early this year, actually. And most of the computational resources, of course, is by Blue Waters. Funding sources from NSF, primarily. So the motivation here is on scalable graphene patterning. Now, all of you know that graphene is one of the most fascinating sort of materials ever. Single atomic layer, but it's extremely strong, extremely stiff. But however, in order to properly use graphene or to make use of, to achieve commercially viable graphene devices and applications, we really need to pattern graphene. So for example, the patterning of holes in graphene can open up a band gap necessary for graphene devices. Creation of nanopores is necessary to for water filtration purposes. Again, holes are also important for DNA sequencing and also for gas purification. So this comes to the question, how can we reliably create holes in graphene, or how can we actually pattern graphene on a very large scale? And one of the possibilities that have been shown in literature is this thing called hydrogen plasma treatment. So essentially, you take a graphene sheet, you place it in a downstream distance in a hydrogen plasma chamber. You plus hydrogen gas into this chamber, and because of the plasma itself, the H2 gas now is converted to essentially hydrogen ions and radicals. So you got hydrogen ions and radicals coming in, and these actually interact with the graphene sheet, which is typically placed on SiO2 substrate. And the result of this is the formation of the potential for selective etching of graphene nanoribbons with no damage to the basal plane. Some studies have also shown the creation of circular holes in the basal plane of the graphene sheet, okay, indicating that the etching is actually isotropic. Others have shown the possibility of the formation of hexagonal shaped holes in graphene. Right. Also, this is typically a result of anisotropic basal plane etching. So we got three possible kind of patterns that may form when we place graphene in a hydrogen plasma chamber. And the question that we have here is, what are the etching mechanisms? How can we control them to achieve the desired nanopattern structure? So three possible mechanisms. Question is why? And for that, we turn to computations performed on Blue Waters. So we use molecular dynamic simulations with the reactive force field potential. This force field potential can account for the interactions between silicon, carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen atoms. And this potential has been shown to be pretty reliable when it comes to modeling of pristine graphene. We get a very accurate lattice spacing. When we compare our results against density functional theory, you get very good CH bonding structure in the sense of you get a very accurate CH bond length, carbon-carbon bond length, and so on and so forth. Barrier energy for hydrogen penetration, okay, and is in pretty good agreement again with DFT calculations. Chem-absorption energy, again, pretty good agreement. Graphene SiO2 equilibrium bond distance, also in pretty good agreement. So we sort of think this potential is pretty reliable for the purpose of our study. So we perform hydrogen ion bombardment, if you would, on a graphene nanoribbon placed on top of SiO2 substrate. Okay, and we just let it run and observe what happens. And depending on the hydrogen ion energy itself, the mechanisms or the interaction mechanisms can be very different. Now, for example, at low hydrogen ion energy, we have very little bonding of hydrogen to the basal plane of graphene. Most of the attachments to graphene occurs along the edges. At higher ion energy, now you get a CH bond formation on the top surface of the graphene sheet. 10 electron volt, you get CH bond formation both at the top and bottom surface of the graphene sheet. And at high
ion energy. You get basically hydrogen ions simply pass through the graphene sheet without causing much damage. Now to see this more clearly, let's filter all the atoms out to show only the graphene sheet. And what we can see here, a circle in blue, is damage caused by etching, caused by hydrogen ion interaction. And over here we have basal plane etching. So we sort of have a very clear transition here from selective etching at 1 eV and 25 eV, and combine etch and basal plane etching at ion energies sort of in the middle. Okay, and the idea is for us to try to link the kinetics of this early stage plasma etching into the experimental relevant length and time scales, right, using MD simulations. So to quantitatively analyze this, the first thing that we did was to try to think of a way to characterize the basal plane etching rate. Okay, essentially, the fraction of carbon-carbon bonds that are broken in a highly periodic graphene sheet. Okay, one with basically infinite sheet with no edges. And we did this for various ion energies, and we get a curve like that. Okay, and we see that at low ion energies or at very high ion energies, we get selective etching. So basal plane etching rate is essentially 0. So no damage to the basal plane of graphene at these energy levels. If we go up to roughly about 5 electron volt over here, we have basically carbon-carbon bonds forming on the top side of graphene sheet. Okay, and if we go up to, let's say, about 10 electron volts, we have carbon-carbon bonds, CH bonds forming both at the top and bottom side, concurrently at the top and bottom side of graphene. Eventually, this breaks off to form CH3, molecules release, and you get etching of the graphene basal plane. And at higher ion energies, now the CH bonds now form on the bottom side of the graphene sheet. Okay, and eventually these break off again, you get CH3 molecules, and you sort of have an etching of the graphene basal plane. So this is sort of what happens when we talk about basal plane etching. Now, when we talk about etching, we have to consider two things. One is, are we talking about the etching along the zigzag direction, or are we talking about etching along the armchair direction? Now, both these are a little bit different. We talk about the zigzag direction, you have high etch reactivity, but you also have high carbon-carbon bond strength. If you look at the armchair etching, you get low etch reactivity because armchair happens to be more stable, but you also have low carbon-carbon bond strength. So these are two sort of competing mechanisms there. And we see that at low ion energy of up to roughly about 6 electron volt, the armchair etching and the basal plane etching rates are roughly the same. Okay, what does this imply? This implies the formation of isotropic holes in the graphene basal plane. Right, you have isotropic etching over here. Now, if you go up at high energies over here, now you have armchair etching, which occurs at a slightly faster rate, roughly about 15% faster rate than the zigzag etching. Okay, and this implies the formation of hexagonal type shaped holes, because if you calculate it out, this distance over here is roughly 15% more than the zigzag distance in the zigzag direction there. So you sort of explain why this happens. But our interest is not just this; it's in obtaining sort of a predictive understanding or predictive estimation of the hole sizes that can result in a hydrogen plasma chamber. So how do we sort of scale these results from MD to the experimental level? Right, we can do this through a very simple one-dimensional micromechanics model, as they call it. So if we consider a circular hole here in the graphene basal plane, okay, of radius r, and during the etching process, if we are interested in this region here whereby the atoms have been etched off, all right, this annular region there in yellow. So you can equate the number of etched carbon atoms in this annular region to simply the area density of graphene, which is rho, and multiplied by 2 pi r dr. Okay, this number of etched atoms, and we equate this to the the contributions from basal plane etching and also edge etching. We add these two contributions together, right? And if we do that, we get an analytical solution of this form, and now we are able to estimate basically the whole radius as a function of the ion fluence, okay, where dB and dE dot essentially comes from the MD simulations. And using this, we sort of try to relate this to the experimental length and time scales. So at low ion energies of, let's say, 1 electron volt over here, we have dB is extremely small, almost 0, and this term drops out, and we sort of get this linear increase in whole radius with fluence. So essentially, there's nothing but selective edge etching of the edges of graphene nanoribbons without any damage to the basal plane. That's at very low ion energies. If we go up to higher ion energies of, let's say, 2 to 3 electron volts. Now, what happens over here is now we get isotropic edge etching, resulting in the formation of circular holes. And the etching rate is also notably extremely fast, right? You can see this sort of exponential increase over here. And this also sort of agrees with what they have seen in experiments, where they have reported something like 40 nanometer per minute per minute etch rate. Okay, this is extremely fast. And sometimes they have observed not just circular holes, but the entire sheet sort of disintegrates almost immediately before you can really capture the pattern. If you go up to slightly higher, not slightly, but quite a bit higher energy of, let's say, 25 electron volt, now you get very stable formation of hexagonal holes this time, right? Because anisotropic etching is now taking place. So 25 eV over here. So with this sort of simple simulations performed on blue waters, we are now able to predict, to understand why, first of all, why these three distinct plasma-graphene reactions actually happen. That's the first thing. We are able to predict when they will actually happen, and we can now go back and look at the plasma process conditions that can be tuned to be able to achieve these sort of graphene nanostructures. So we are able to link the plasma process conditions to the actual microstructure that can be produced in this process. Now, where blue waters comes in is basically in the computations of the basal plane and the basal plane etching rate and the edge etching rates. Essentially, dE dot here and dB dot in this simple equation. How long does this take? Well, each data point here requires roughly about 30,000 CPU hours to compute, roughly 10 days on a 128 core machine, and we actually tried to run this on exceed resources initially, but we found that this was not possible, and we needed a more scalable platform in order to do this sort of computations. Okay, so this is the last slide I have up here. And this sort of conclusion slide is that the blue waters computations have enabled us to pursue some science in mechanics. Now, this is a typical mechanics problem. Why is it a mechanics problem? Because in the mechanics problem, we have a sort of a set of conditions. We have some experimental observation that we see. And in this case is the question of different etching mechanisms that result from when you place graphene sheet in the plasma chamber. So these are from the experimental observations. And we use computational tools that we have, in this case molecular dynamic simulations, to develop models to predict and explain this phenomena, all this with an application in mind, which is the move towards graphene-based transistors. Right, so that's the conclusion we have over here.